and that they preserved during their time in this country. But I also, as you say, want to try and also draw out some of the broader cultural points which apply not just to them, but also to others of German Jewish origin. So I'm going to start in just a second when I've got this little thing which has come up on the screen, and I'm going to get that out of the way. That's the recording. Great. So just to start with a little bit of background, this is a map of Germany, and you can see the village of Messel down in the southwest between Frankfurt and Darmstadt. And the Messel family took their name from the village of Messel because it was the village which gave them refuge. They were driven out of Bentheim, which is a county right up on the Dutch border. You can see it up in the northwest. They were driven out by an edict of the Elector of Hanover, who was ruling over the county at the time, and who happened, of course, to be George III of Britain. And all Jews in the county, bar a few who were given exceptional leave to remain, were told to pack their bags and leave within 6 weeks. So the Messel family, or as they were called at that time, the Bentheim family, moved hundreds of miles further south and found refuge in the village of Messel. And Messel at that time was in the Grand Duchy of Hesse, and it was a very thriving Jewish community. In fact, at the time when they arrived there, 1 in 6 families in Messel was Jewish, so a very much higher proportion than in the rest of Germany as a whole. And it was one of the first villages to apply to have its own synagogue, which was built right in the center of the village. And as you can see here, it had its own burial ground in the nearby town of Dieburg. And the tomb which you see on the left is in fact my 5 times great-grandfather, Gumpel. And the tomb to the right in the shadow, the much smaller one, is my 6 times great-grandfather, Aaron. And it was extraordinary to be able to find these things. They're always very moving places, these Jewish cemeteries in Germany, but to actually stand in front of one's own ancestors was really a very special moment. You can see from the better preserved tombstone of Gumpel that ewer or pitcher at the top, which represents the Levite tribe, the ancient tribe of the Levites, in as much as that was then used, that ewer, to wash the hands of the Kohanim, the priests, in the services. And the family prospered. This is a picture on the right of Aaron Messel, who was the next generation down. And he founded a bank in Darmstadt, which is the capital of the Grand Duchy of Hesse. And he married, on the left, Caroline Stern, who was from the very prestigious Stern family of Frankfurt, who'd become very wealthy during the 18th century as merchants, and then did even more wealth for themselves in the 19th century as bankers. And Aaron, as I say, he prospered. You can see here that he presents himself as a middle-class German, nicely attired, a 3-piece suit with a wing collar, a cravat, and his wife Caroline very much in the Biedermeier style, which was prevalent in the bourgeoisie in Germany at that time. But already it's interesting in terms of their artistic, cultural background that they have chosen to have this pair of portraits painted of themselves looking very well-to-do in German costumes. And I think that automatically shows that even at that early stage, you've got the buying in to German artistic and cultural milieus by a German Jewish family, because they were very definitely Jewish. He was one of the 5 elected members of the executive committee leading the Jewish community of Darmstadt, so he was known very much in that role. They did very well for themselves, as I say. This is the square in the new development in Darmstadt where they lived. And in fact, that house on the right-hand side with the steps going up to it is the house number 9 in Ludwigsplatz, where he set up his home and indeed the family bank. And you can see from the people milling around in the square, this was a very up-and-coming bourgeois and successful city. But what I really want to focus at in this slide here is what this meant in cultural, socio-cultural terms for the German Jewish community. And this is a picture of the Pädagog, which was the oldest Lutheran school in Darmstadt. It had been going since the 17th century. And in 1823, all of the Jews living in the Grand Duchy of Hesse were required, like everybody else, to join the mainstream education. So instead of having had separate Jewish schools as there had been in previous generations, these Messel children and all of the subsequent generations in Germany were brought up in the German mainstream tradition. And they were schooled in the predominant philosophy of the 19th century, which was new humanism. This idea carried forward from the Enlightenment that education should be about bringing out the sensibilities of an individual, their moral, their intellectual, and also, very crucially, their aesthetic sensibilities. And art, music, the collecting of art and appreciation of beauty was absolutely central to that education. And it was doubly central to the new identity that German Jews were forming at that time, moving away from their traditional identity, perhaps as a religious community, and being much more integrated into the mainstream of German culture, but with this very, very pronounced dedication to culture and cultural advancement. As Heinrich Heine is believed to have said, they were like the Germans, only more so. And the most famous of the Messels to have remained in Germany was Alfred Messel, who you can see here in this portrait by Reinhold Lepsius. And he became one of the most famous German architects at the end of the 19th century into the 20th century. Indeed, he actually became the preferred chief architect to Kaiser Wilhelm II himself, and acted almost as an arbiter of taste for the Kaiser in the last years of his life. As you can see, he was born in Darmstadt, but he moved to Berlin, which is really where his career took off. And we have access through the archives in Berlin to some of the drawings which he did of earlier buildings. This is actually the State Museum in Hesse, in Darmstadt. And I think it's a really wonderful evocation from one of his drawings as to how he wanted the museum to look. It actually took quite a long time to build. And in the process of building, it was rather simplified, so that as you see it today, it hasn't got all of the embellishments that he put on his drawing. But it has just been through a very long period of rehabilitation, renovation, and it was reopened a few years ago. And I thoroughly recommend to anybody who finds themselves over in the west of Germany to stop in and pay it a visit, because it's an amazing place. And this slightly moderner feel, this pared down form of architecture, did begin to characterize Alfred Messel's work. This is another of the civic commissions that he received for the townhouse in the Saxon city of Ballenstedt. And this was considered by one of his greatest fans at the time to have been his masterpiece. But really, the work which put him on the map in terms of European architecture came later in 1906, when he was responsible for this ultra-modernist extension of the Wertheim department store in Berlin. And this is the facade looking out onto Leipziger Platz, so one of the central Berlin squares. And it really took the whole of Germany by storm, this incredibly pared down, severe, but quasi-Gothic structure, which when you see pictures of it as it was bombed out in the Second World War, could actually have been an old German Gothic cathedral. As I say, it was bombed out, and so we have nothing but the old photographs as records of this anymore. Whereas if you go to Berlin today, you can still see the Pergamon Museum, which was his last and final design. In fact, he never lived to see it built. He died of a heart attack in 1909. And his great friend, Ludwig Hoffmann, another of the Berlin-based architects, took it on and finished it many, many years later. And again, it's an extraordinary, empowering, imposing work, which you can visit today. But I want to come to Britain, and that is in the form of Ludwig Messel, who was Alfred's older brother. He, as you can see, was also born in Darmstadt, but he came over to Britain in the 1860s and set up as a stockbroker with his own firm, which he founded a few years later. And again, he was very successful. He was able to take advantage of some of the huge international security trading which was going on at that time, particularly some of the trading coming out of South Africa and the diamond and the gold rushes there. And as a result of that success, he was able to set up his family, his wife and his 6 children, in the rather magnificent surroundings of Westbourne Terrace, just north of Hyde Park. And you can see it here in this rather wonderful lithograph from after the time it was built. And you can see it at the north end of it, it's still looking out into open fields, which is now, of course, Maida Vale and Kilburn and Cricklewood and beyond. And this was a highly desirable part of London. It was called Tyburnia, and it was very deliberately set in order to rival Belgravia, south of the park. Belgravia, of course, was where the homes of the aristocracy and the nobility had been made for 40, 50 years already. Tyburnia was a much more cosmopolitan area. It was an area which was favored by Greek families, by French families, by German families, even by Latin American families living in London. And it had a particularly strong Jewish presence as well. So there are a number of synagogues all based around that, what we would now see as a sort of broader Bayswater area. But what was fascinating at the time, Ludwig Messel himself didn't really engage in religious worship of any sort. He was married to a Christian woman, but the marriage took place in a Unitarian chapel, which didn't really require any particular statement of faith on his part. And all of his 6 children were baptized in the church just south of where we're looking now, St. James's, Sussex Gardens. Ludwig Messel, like many other German Jews, really wasn't motivated by religion, it seems. And indeed, we know from a lot of the records of the time that Anglo-Jewish communities were quite irritated by the fact that a lot of these German Jewish migrants to Britain really weren't joining in synagogues or in communal activities. That isn't to say that Ludwig Messel, and indeed the other German Jews who came in, were oblivious of their Jewish roots at all. I mean, Ludwig joined the Anglo-Jewish Association, which is the charitable arm of Anglo-Jewry at the time. He also gave to Jewish causes throughout his life, as well as to non-Jewish causes. And a lot of his early business partners were from Jewish backgrounds. But I thought, particularly for our focus on the immigrant art, it would be worth just mentioning that Ludwig Messel was one of the original donors behind the founding of the Whitechapel Art Gallery shown here. And together with Sir Edgar Speyer, who gave the main bulk of the money, he was responsible for having this opened in 1901 as a free exhibition space, showing exhibitions of great art to the people of the East End around Whitechapel, which of course at that time was predominantly Jewish. And I have this lovely slide which comes from the Whitechapel Gallery, gallery's own archive, showing this little family group of children who had obviously been allowed in to see this free exhibition exactly as it was meant to be. Ludwig Messel himself became a collector of old masters in a small, a limited way, but the pieces which he bought were really quite impressive, large works. This is by Sir Joshua Reynolds, A Holy Family with the Infant St. John the Baptist. It's one of two copies of, two replicas of the same work, one now in the Tate collection. This other rather wonderful portrait of Sarah Harrop, who was a Lancastrian opera singer of the 18th century, is by Angelica Kaufmann, and it's now in the Princeton University Art Museum, and they consider it really one of the highlights of their collection. And it's rather wonderful also to find images where you can see these works as they were enjoyed in the family. This is from the dining room of the Messel home, showing the Angelica Kaufmann above the mantelpiece, and what a grand piece it was there as well. 1890, so when Ludwig Messel had been in Britain for 25 years and had made his money, he bought the West Sussex estate of Nymans, which is of course now well known as a very popular National Trust property. And this is an image of the house, the villa in Regency style when he bought it. And already then you can see it's quite an exotic place with a Marinda spruce on the left, monkey puzzle tree on the right, and this lady with her parasol walking across the lawn as a gardener tends the grass. A very nice property to have. It had 400 acres of land together with it, and it represented, I think, two particular statements on the part of the Messel family. Firstly, that sense that they were putting down their roots in this new country, this adopted country, in a way which would have been much more difficult in Germany, where there had been such restrictions for so long on Jews owning property and land. But also it made the statement that they were going to integrate even more fully and become English in the next generation. And I think that that's very much the trajectory which Ludwig hoped to set for the family as a whole. He sent both of his sons to Eton and then to Oxford, and his three first daughters all married into solid English middle-class families. The house looks fairly sizable, but it wasn't considered to be big enough. And Ludwig called in his brother Alfred, who we've met already, to design an extension explicitly in the continental European style. So their transformation into an English family wasn't by any means complete at this stage. And this is the design that Alfred came up with, a sort of Germanic Renaissance tower, and then this rather strange two-story, almost alpine-like chalet on the edge of it. And that was indeed what was built, with certain amendments and simplifications. But you can see it here, the chalet and the Renaissance tower rather knocked on the end of a Regency villa. But at this end, these massive conservatories, which you can see were on the southwest of the house. And that is an indication right from this early time of how seriously Ludwig Messel took the whole idea of gardening, of horticultural experimentation, for which Nymans became very well known. And he appointed a wonderful head gardener called James Coomber, who together with Messel developed all sorts of new varieties of plants, some of them which had been brought back from the plant hunting expeditions of the late Victorian Edwardian eras, but others which they had cultivated themselves at Nymans. And here is what we believe to be the only extant picture by Ludwig himself, a painting of the Pinetum at Nymans from those early days. And there is a wonderful book which is available actually online if you go to the archive.org website, called A Garden Flora, which itemizes over 2,000 of the plants which were grown, tried out, propagated at Nymans. And it comes complete with these rather lovely line drawings by Alfred Parsons, the botanical and other painter as well. This is a rather nice one of the Davidia involucrata, which is more usually known as the handkerchief tree, which again is something for which Nymans is still very famous. And in fact, I was there just 2-3 weeks ago, and the handkerchief trees which they have out in the garden were absolutely brilliant this year, a magnificent showing. But it's also an opportunity to introduce one of the next generation of the Messel family, and it's Muriel Messel, one of several very talented and creative women within the Messel family. And she was responsible for bringing together this book with all of the illustrations, with all of the very detailed notes about how you should try and bring up some of the plants, how they will survive over the winter, etc., etc. And it's amazing to think over 100 years on that the team, the National Trust team at Nymans, still use this book as a reference tool today. You can see from the dates of Muriel Messel's life that she died very young. In fact, in the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918. And so having just come through the coronavirus one, I think we can all feel this is even more poignant, a poignant tribute to her to have this book still in existence. But it was her brother, Leonard Messel, who took on Nymans, and he had been brought up very much as an Englishman. As I say, he went to Eton and then to Oxford. He served in the territorial forces of the British Army, and he was eventually appointed High Sheriff of Sussex in 1936. So he became very much a pillar of the community and considered very much to be an English gentleman, as he was called in his obituaries. And he and his wife Maud really wanted to leave behind that Germanic background, and particularly the Germanic house, which Nymans had become through its extension. And they were the ones, after the First World War, who undertook this transformation of the house at Nymans. So instead of that Regency villa with the Renaissance tower and the Alpine chalet, they created this extraordinary replica of a 15th century manor house. And all the people who saw it at the time just said it's a completely convincing pastiche. It's believable that this actually could have been built 500 years ago, not, as it was, completely new in the 1920s. But it was very much part of this appropriation of a new English identity and a very new, strong cultural identity with that. And of course, this is the ruins of the house which we see today. Anyone who visits Nymans will know that this is very much part of the visitor experience, these romantic ruins, which are the remnants of the house which burnt down in 1947 in an accident in that very freezing cold winter. It took them almost all the 1920s to build it up, and it took just 3 hours for it to be burnt down. But we still have these amazing photographs from the inside as well, courtesy of a Country Life feature, which was brought out in 1932. And that gives a sense of the collecting of art and the presentation of art in this space. On the left-hand side, over those two doorways, you can see an amazing Bonifacio Veronese piece which Ludwig had bought earlier. And then the tapestries on the wall, the antique English furniture, which was one of Leonard Messel's great pride and joys, the sedan chair on the right, and then other paintings higher up. Just across the hall from the drawing room, which we've just seen, was the library. And here, over the mantelpiece, there was an original Velasquez, which had been bought by Ludwig again at the end of the 19th century. And I say original Velázquez advisedly. It has not been shown to be an original Velázquez, but it was believed to be in the family. And it also, I'm afraid, was one of the victims of the fire. Everything in the library went up in smoke, and nothing from this particular part of the house was saved. And that was a particular tragedy for Leonard Messel himself, because he had built up an absolutely unique private library of botanical volumes stretching back to the earliest days of printing, and indeed even before that. And you can see some of them in the shelves there. Extraordinary works, sometimes so rare that they were the only known copy of a particular book, perhaps from early 16th century Germany. And you can get a sense of the grandeur, the splendor of these works from the one which does survive, which is this copy of Leonard Fuchs's De Historia Stirpium. And you can see here a gorgeous book with the Latin text and these fantastic colored illustrations showing, in this case, the poppy. But this was only one of several passions that Leonard Messel had for collecting. The other one for which he was perhaps best known at the time is his collection of fans, which spanned both European fans, going right back to the Renaissance, East Asian fans from Japan and China, and this extraordinary fan from South America produced during the 17th century. So if you think this actually survives from the time of the Restoration in Britain, and it was produced for the European market. And Leonard Messel became what was seen in the Edwardian era as a serious collector, a connoisseur who really put an enormous amount of effort into learning about the things he collected and to sharing them with other enthusiasts. He became the worshipful master of the fan makers. He used to hold fan evenings where he would invite other connoisseurs round to be able to look at some of the specimens he had in his collection. And these are now on block in the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge, which has preserved them as a collection to this day. You get a sense of how important collecting was for him because he actually turned whole rooms of his house in London over to being a museum. This was just part of the museum room in their home in Lancaster Gate. And it gives you a bit of a sense of the breadth of the collections that he formed. Japanese netsuke, silver coins, any number of porcelains, and just a vast range. And rather than going any further into it, I was just going to sort of draw one example out of those. This amazing enameled Venetian dish, which incredibly, looking at its state of preservation, comes from the end of the 15th century and was handed down through the Messel family from that time. That was the milieu in which his children were brought up. And his daughter, Anne Messel, in fact, wrote an autobiographical sketch of herself later in her life, where she called herself a collector's daughter. And she said it was a very eccentric upbringing. She wasn't really sent to school in any way, but she, as you can see her here, is posed with an improving book, probably about some obscure form of Japanese fans from the early period. And she grew to be one of the bright young things. I mean, she was very well known in England, in the London society in the interwar period. She married twice, first to Ronald Armstrong Jones, and then secondly to the Earl of Ross. So she became the Countess of Ross and was very much part of that story of the Messel's social mobility upwards during the time. She had the most amazing clothes made for her by couturiers throughout her life, particularly in the pre-war period by Charlie James. And she took on the role of preserving the collection of Messel dresses and other attire, which was then passed down and is now in the Brighton Museum. And again, this is an extraordinary example of dresses and other accessories which have been preserved through the generations. And I really recommend the book, which I'm showing up on the screen now, if anybody wants to follow that more closely. It's a wonderful record of this collecting passion, which in this case wasn't just about items which had been bought simply for a collection. This was about pieces which had been worn for specific occasions, and they held the memory of each of those occasions within the dress. And there are wonderful notes next to them saying when they were worn and by whom and for what occasion. But perhaps Anne Messel's greatest legacy came through the preservation of 18 Stafford Terrace in Kensington, which is better known today as Linley Sambourne House. And it's one of the most extraordinary museums in London to give you a snapshot of what it was like to live in London in the 1890s in a middle-class home. And Anne preserved the house as it had been handed down to her from her mother's side of the family. Linley Sambourne, the Punch cartoonist, was her grandfather. And she then gave it, well, sold it to the GLC, the Greater London Council, in the 1980s, and it was then passed on from there to the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, who run it today. This was also the setting for perhaps an even greater moment when she, together with John Betjeman, Nicholas Pevsner, Kenneth Clarke and others, founded the Victorian Society at the end of the 1950s. And Victorian Society was very much a counterweight to the Georgian group, which had already been in existence to try to preserve 18th century architecture. The Victorian Society was very much there to preserve the 19th century and indeed Edwardian architecture on top of that. And it was Anne's baby. And she always saw this as one of her greatest accomplishments, having been brought up with a love of art, a consciousness of the need to preserve art and architecture. She very much saw it as her role to form a society which would enable this to continue, as it does continue today. But it's Anne's brother, Oliver Messel, who is probably the best known member of the family for his creative cultural contribution. He was the youngest in the family and therefore given much more license than his elder brother, Linley, who was told pretty unceremoniously to join the family firm and become a stockbroker. Oliver was allowed to follow the artistic inclination, which was the other side of the family. And he went to the Slade and studied under Professor Henry Tonks. And you can see him here with one of the early masks that he made when he was still at the Slade. He used to experiment with his friend Rex Whistler, the artist, in making these papier-mâché masks. And it's this which gave him his first big break. Diaghilev, the impresario of the Ballet Russe, saw one of the masks and asked Oliver to create a series of masks for his own opera, which was coming to London. And Oliver obliged and was very, warmly thanked for having done that. This led on to a series of commissions by Charles Cochrane, who put on these amazing reviews in London every year. And this is from 1926, from a piece called Dart's Little Lady, done by Noel Coward as part of one of those reviews. And it shows the impact of these masks as they came together, and they became very much his calling card in the early part of his career. And at this stage, I must say a big thank you to the University of Bristol Theatre Collection for allowing us to use these images. The University of Bristol Theatre Collection has got the Oliver Messel archive, and it's an incredibly rich store letters, photographs, and details all the way through his life, much of which I'll be drawing on in this talk. Excuse me. So this really kick-started Oliver's career, and he never looked back. He was involved in theatre, ballet, and then cinema. He was taken over to Hollywood in the 1930s to create the costume and sets for the production of Romeo and Juliet, starring Leslie Howard, as you can see in the middle of these two warring factions. And what's interesting, of course, is the film itself was in black and white, but the promotional publicity posters, which you can see here, showed the full range of color which Oliver brought to the designs. And indeed, he was paid for by Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer to go on a 3-week tour of Italy, collecting fabric samples and other inspirations that he could then bring back to the film. As I say, that was in black and white in 1936. 4 years later, the cinema-going public did get a chance to see the full color palette which he brought, in this case, to the extraordinary film The Thief of Baghdad, directed by Alexander Korda. And of course, if we're thinking about the contribution of immigrants to the cultural life of this country, Alexander Korda was a Hungarian, of Hungarian Jewish background himself. And it was an extraordinary film shown in London at the height of the Blitz. And you can imagine the sort of response to these dramatic scenes in this high color at a time when the German bombs were falling down around the cinemas. And I thoroughly encourage anybody to spend an hour and a half watching the film. It's freely available on YouTube, and it really is one of those films which they don't make the like of anymore. At the end of the Second World War, again, Oliver Messel was engaged in one of his greatest pieces, which was the Caesar and Cleopatra, with Vivian Leigh, as you can see there, as Cleopatra, and on the left, a rather dashing Stuart Granger as Apollodorus. And again, by Hungarian-born immigrant director Gabriel Pascal. And all this time, as his reputation was building, Oliver Messel still continued as a painter, which is one of the things he was first trained in. And he was very much influenced in his painting style by Glyn Philpott, who was really his mentor at the early stages of his career. And of course, there's that great Philpott exhibition currently at the Pallant House Gallery down in Chichester. This is one of the early portraits which Oliver did, but he continued to do such portraits all the way through his life. This is Princess Natalia Pavey, a painting which is currently still at Nyman's in the National Trust collection there. But it was really in that period, at the end of the Second World War, that Oliver came into his own as the internationally famous stage designer. And his real moment was in this production of The Sleeping Beauty at Covent Garden in February 1946, when the whole country was coming out of the horrors of the Second World War, but still very much in doom and gloom. Rationing was still in place. And Oliver Messel managed to create this fantasy world on stage, full of color, full of magic, of beauty, and he really stole the show. And in fact, it's rather funny if you look at the poster on the left, how his name gets an even bigger billing than that of Tchaikovsky, who you might feel had more claim to be in bigger letters at the time. And this led on to many commissions for Oliver at Glyndebourne, where he spent a lot of the 1950s, and indeed elsewhere throughout the world. It also led on to commissions for interior design and decoration. These are some of the pictures of the Dorchester, the two suites which he developed there. This is the penthouse suite and the dining room in it, where you can still see the same influence of the theatrical world. as it is in the bedroom suite, the Oliver Messel suite, which you can hire to this day. It's £5,000 a night, so perhaps not for anything but the most special occasions. But he carried that on into other commissions. This was for Rain's shoe shop in Bond Street. And again, you can see the proscenium arch over the different booths and the curtains with a very strong theatrical feel. Theatres themselves, this is the Rose Hill Theatre in Whitehaven. And if you look above the proscenium arch here, you can see the pediment with the ox eye window in it becomes a motif which he was then able to carry on into the next stage of his career when he was designing houses in the Caribbean. He moved to Barbados in the 1960s primarily because he was suffering from acute arthritis, and he knew that the climate in the Caribbean was far better than in Britain. And he was commissioned to start recreating this magical Rococo world in the Caribbean setting. And he really spent the last few years of his life as very much a sought after architect, designer in that way, not just in Barbados, but also on the billionaire's island of Mustique. And this is the villa which he designed there for Princess Margaret, as you can see sitting in front of it, called Les Jolies Eaux. And it was an extraordinary sense of the Messel family having made it into that highest echelon of society. But of course, the mention of Princess Margaret brings us to the most famous Messel, which was Tony Armstrong-Jones, the son of Anne Messel from her first marriage, and really one of the most creative photographers of that period, particularly after the Second World War. He's known now, obviously, to most people as the person who married the Queen's sister, and indeed anybody who watched the Netflix series The Crown would have seen that in all its glory. But originally he trained as a photographer, and he wanted to push the boundaries of photography in that period when it was still quite a staid art form. This is the first of his professional works that was published in the Tatler, showing cockle hunting at Blakeney Point in Norfolk. But he also did much more conventional portraits. This one of his grandmother, Maud Messel, viewing some paintings which she'd been given by her son, Oliver. His breakthrough came when he was asked to do the birthday photographs for Prince Charles on his 8th birthday. And this is Prince Charles with Princess Anne in what was considered at the time a revolutionary portrait of royal children as children, rather than being stood up in front of a rather artificial pose. This was them doing what they liked doing, just reading in one of these long galleries in Buckingham Palace. And from there, he was really able to build this career as a photojournalist. And one of the great works that he put together at the end of the 50s was this book called London, which was a grainy view of the capital using the sort of much more handheld instant camera techniques rather than the posed and slightly staged cameras which were used by other photographers at the time. He followed that up in the 1960s with this amazing folio book of the art world in that time in London, with fantastic portraits of David Hockney, Barbara Hepworth, Francis Bacon, and others, which again is a fantastic book if you can search out a copy of it. As a result of marrying into the royal family, he got some pretty extraordinary commissions in other forms of design as well. This was his quite well-known Snowdon Aviary in London Zoo, which has now been turned, I believe, into an enclosure for Cotobus monkeys, but I'm not entirely sure why. If you go round the edge of Regent's Park, you can still see it in all its glory like this. And other one-off design moments, he was responsible for designing the entire performance of the investiture of Prince Charles as Prince of Wales in 1969. And this is this rather fantastic picture by his assistant, Carl Toms, of how Snowdon had really pared down what would have been a very cluttered royal occasion into a very sparse modern scene. You can see the thrones, which would usually have been there, are actually just these very simple seats, and that is indeed how it eventually ended up looking in the investiture itself. So he was known. He continued to work as a Sunday Times photojournalist. He was responsible for some of these very hard-hitting photojournalistic studies of social issues, both in Britain and also abroad. He took a series in India as well, until he became really the story himself. And there were Sunday Times features on him as a photographer, and indeed the final retrospective, which was held at the National Portrait Gallery towards the end of his life. Those are perhaps the most well-known of the Messels in those generations. I'm just going to finish off by whizzing through some of the next generations, because of course Snowdon's son, who's now the second Earl of Snowdon, was David Linley, who became a cabinet maker and a designer in his own right, following in fact in the footsteps of his 3 times great-grandfather, another of the Messels, who was sent to Paris in the 19th century to become a cabinet maker at that time. And Linley, as he's called in terms of his professional life, has been very successful in pursuing that career. His sister also, Sarah Armstrong-Jones, as she's called in her working life, Lady Sarah Chatto otherwise, has become a painter. She trained both at Camberwell and at the Royal Academy, and has been represented by the Redfern Gallery for many years. Abstract landscape, but also more figurative, creative pictures like the one shown here. In the Messel family more generally, Victoria Messel, who sadly passed away just a few months ago, she was a botanical painter who founded the Florilegium at Nyman's and started painting the plants which have got the Messel name to them. So this is Camellia Leonard Messel, as painted by Victoria Messel. Her brother Thomas Messel, who again was another furniture designer, as you can see from the chair, drawing inspiration again from his uncle Oliver Messel and that whole theatrical world. And Thomas also edited the fantastic book about Oliver Messel and his career, which I thoroughly recommend. It's the most wonderful set of essays on all the aspects of his life there. Thomas's son in the current generation, Hal Messel, who has trained as a silversmith and has been incredibly successful in that respect, with his work being shown at the British Museum, at Windsor, and in many private collections as well. And I'm not going to have time to mention another of the people who I was able to focus on a bit in the book, Rudolf Messel, who was a filmmaker through the 1930s and into the post-war years. This is a shot of him in one of the films that he made, an anti-war film, because he was also a socialist and a pacifist. Or indeed his sister Phoebe Messel, which is my grandmother, who trained in the Sorbonne, and we found this amazing picture which she had painted just a couple of years ago, showing that she also was brought up in this artistic tradition. But I don't want to finish until I've mentioned her namesake, another Phoebe in the current generation, Phoebe Stewart Carter, who was again trained as a painter in Florence and is now actually an artist in residence there, specializing particularly in portraits. And this is one of the wonderful works which I think she's done. If any of you saw this show that was at the Mall last month of the Royal Society of Portrait Painters, you will also have seen more of her work there. But I want to conclude, because I know I've gone a little bit longer than I should, I want to conclude just by popping back to the German side of the family. And Irene Messel, as you see her on the left with her daughter Ina, she was the last surviving child of Alfred Messel, the architect. And she was brought up in Germany, and she stayed, married Wolfgang Bruck, as you see on the right. And when they married, they hyphenated their name together. So they were both called Bruck Messel afterwards. He, again, came from a German Jewish family, which was very acculturated. His father was a magistrate who had a fantastic collection of 18th century art. Both he and his father served in the German army in the First World War. You can see him here with the black and white band of the Iron Cross for distinguished service. But even though they'd been brought up as Christians within the Lutheran faith, they were considered by the Nazis under the 1935 Nuremberg race laws as full Jews, Volljuden, and therefore exposed to all of the horrors of persecution at that time. And it was only 4 months before the beginning of the Second World War that they managed to escape Berlin with the whole, their two children, Irene and Wolfgang, and they came to Britain with their English cousins, their Messel cousins who already lived here, as their financial sponsors. And I particularly wanted to introduce this because Wolfgang himself had also been brought up in this artistic tradition, which was so prevalent amongst the German Jews. And he, in that period after the Second World War, in 1945, 6, and 7, had his paintings shown by the Ben-Uri Gallery here in London. So it's a lovely way of showing that he managed also to continue that tradition thanks to the Ben-Uri Gallery. And this is just one example of his paintings, a rather lovely sunflower study, which I think looks quite like those flower studies done by Jacob Epstein as well. So it gives a sense of the company he was keeping. So I want to finish there just to say that this, for me, really represents one family amongst many German Jewish migrant families who came to Britain with this incredibly strong cultural impulse, which they got from that background, that educational background in the German mainstream system. And hopefully, if I've left a tiny bit of time for questions and discussion, we can perhaps draw on that as we go forward. But thank you so much for listening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. That's absolutely amazing talk, covering so much ground for us, and that great richness across so many generations of so many different visual arts and other arts which were taken on by the family and seem to be passed down almost in a line of descent with the various painters, the botanical illustrations, the architecture, interiors, photography, everything. It's just extraordinary that that was all encompassed in one family. And I'm sure people are going to be putting lots of questions into the chat for you, which we'll try and fit in. And I just wanted to kick off with a couple while people are getting their fingers poised over the keys to try and get the sense of encompassing that great reach of time covered by this family as well. So going back to the beginning almost, John, you mentioned the cultural background which the Messels shared with other German Jewish immigrants who came to Britain around the same time. And could you tell us a little bit more about whether they were a typical family in respect of those kind of artistic leanings?
No, absolutely. And this has actually been the focus of my research since writing the book, has been to look at a dozen other of these German Jewish families who came to Britain and who seem to have had a similar cultural background and a real desire to leave their mark on the world of art collecting and creation in this country. You think, for example, of the Mond collection of Renaissance art, which went into the National Gallery, and also in the second generations after that, a very artistic family. So I've been able to follow that whole cultural impulse through in other families as well. What I think is extraordinary about the Messel family is that it lasted so many generations, as you were pointing out, and also flowered in other creative mediums, so film, architecture, design, and all the others. And that, I think, really set them apart. And it was partly, I think, because of the security of having a wealthy family, a background where the children did feel that they had the freedom to express themselves in those ways, but also a very strong artistic core, which seems to have come all the way through in a way which didn't happen with all the families. So I would say, yes, they were typical in respect of their cultural background, but perhaps they were still special in terms of how they expressed it in each generation.
Because they were all incredibly professional at every level, weren't they? You know, sometimes with a very wealthy family, they might be seen to be, you know, dilettante or so forth, but they were not that at all. You know, even, you know, as collectors, that the attitude was very professional, very organized, and, you know, taking steps to ensure there was a legacy there, preserving the house, the Linley Sanborn house, preserving the place at Nyman's, and, you know, part of the story there that, you know, this dreadful fire, which of course you could only touch upon, but having, you know, made this artistic contribution as collectors, but also architecturally, and then of course the gardens, which are such a glory today, and then the many botanical illustrators within the family, which I find really interesting as well. So I'm going on too long, so let's just ask you another one of a question we've already had in, and then we'll turn to the chat box. So I've got here a question about the architect Alfred Messel. How did he manage to succeed in Berlin at a time when anti-Semitism was so prevalent among the Prussian state authorities?
No, absolutely. I think that's it's a deep question, because clearly it was a time when there was an enormous suspicion amongst the Prussian court and amongst the authorities against people of Jewish origin. But it was a time when Berlin was absolutely booming with the combination of Jewish businessmen, of artists, of collectors, of people of all different backgrounds making such a contribution. To begin with, Alfred Messel was also held in suspicion. We know that the Kaiser, for example, at one point said he couldn't take on this role as the chief architect because he was considered to be too modern, and this fear of modernism almost embodying an international anti-German element to it was very strong. But I think it was just through virtue of his clear talents and the sorts of buildings that he was creating that eventually won round Kaiser Wilhelm and a lot of the other members of the Prussian authorities, and then more generally the German public as well. So one would hope that he had an influence in that respect of trying to break down some of those prejudices, but clearly not with the sort of lasting effect that one would like. But his story is absolutely wonderful, and unfortunately there hasn't really been a focused or a biography of him in English as yet. There's a lot of work being done in German, which is incredibly rich on his life and career. But he certainly is somebody who repays study much more than I think he's got to date.
Perhaps another future project for you, John. You must have done encyclopedic research for the volume. I know the stories are unfolded in even greater detail there, which is marvelous. And I loved learning about Tyburnia, which I wasn't familiar with that term, and it's sort of attempting to rival Belgravia. And then that wonderful connection with the Whitechapel Art Gallery, which again made me think of many of the artists in the Benery collection from the so-called Whitechapel boy generation, Bomber, Gertler, etc., who were so tied up with the Whitechapel Gallery. And I just wanted to ask you also a little bit more about Oliver Messel. You showed us those fantastic masks, wonderful photographs and images there. And I just wondered what inspired him with the creation of the masks. You showed very clearly how one project led on to another, and he was able to take something over from each project, which was fantastic. But what was the beginning? What was the real inspiration at the start, do you feel?
Well, from what I understand, it was one of those things where he was almost fooling about with Rex Whistler outside the main thrust of their studies at the Slade. I don't think he really fitted in with the discipline of the artistic training at the Slade. He was much less given to being sort of told what to do in that respect. And he and Rex Whistler just sort of went around and played on the weekends or after hours with the formulation of these masks. The masks seem to come very much from a Greek tragedy background, the masks which were worn by the chorus figures in Greek tragedy. And that's why they worked so well, both for the Diaghilev Ballet Russe and also for the Cochrane Reviews. But really, you know, it's fascinating reading in some of the society magazines of the 1920s. And the Messel mask is really a commonly used trope. It's something which people throw in to conversation about, you know, oh, well, if you've been out partying too much, you'll end up looking like a Messel mask. It's part of sort of popular culture as well, which is extraordinary to find out.
Yeah, oh well, they're incredibly arresting images. So I just wanted to share with you some of the comments. So we've had lots of lovely comments saying what a fantastic talk, and how you managed to close it in such a circular fashion. So lots of praise there. We also have a message here from Barbara Howard, who says she was born and brought up in Norwich and first heard of Oliver Messel from a room named after him in Norwich Assembly House. And she asks whether Oliver had any particular connection with Norwich, as well as thanking you for the great talk.
Yes, it's a very good question. And it's something I do go into a little bit in the book. During the Second World War, Oliver was put in charge of a camouflage section within the British Army. And this was very much seen as part of the war effort at a time when there were still great fears of an invasion following Dunkirk and all of that. You know, people were on invasion alert. And various painters, not just Oliver, but also Julian Trevelyan and others, and Rex Whistler, were sent out as part of the war effort to camouflage some of the key buildings around the country. And Oliver found himself in Norwich to set up a camouflage unit. And he found that the assembly rooms were really not being used for anything else except storing stuff at that time. And he requisitioned the assembly rooms in Norwich and used them as the headquarters of the camouflage unit for that bit of the country. And they did training in camouflage techniques for other people within the armed forces, which became incredibly popular, apparently. So that's the connection from that point of view.
Oh, fantastic. And one thinks a bit with all the Rex Whistler and so forth as well of Charles Ryder in Brideshead and that whole generation that you mentioned. We have a question here from Robert Drake as well, and he's asking about the great rivalry between Beaton and Messel, and he asks if there was also one between Beaton and Armstrong.
Absolutely correct. It really was. It went down from one generation to the next. And there's a gorgeous story in relation to the Caesar and Cleopatra film, which I alluded to earlier, where Oliver was very nervous about asking a £10,000 fee for the design for the Caesar and Cleopatra film. And so he said to Cecil Beaton, you know, do you think I'm asking too much there? And Cecil Beaton said, no, it's absolutely fine. And then proceeded to undercut him. He went to Pascal, the director, and said, I can do the same design as Messel is offering you, but for a lesser price. So there was a really sort of nasty, barbed relationship there. And then when Tony Armstrong-Jones took on, it really shook up Cecil Beaton even more, because of course he was the royal photographer of choice. So he saw that, having got rid of Oliver Messel as a rival, he now had Oliver Messel's nephew coming in and stealing his thunder as well. So yeah, it was, I mean, they lived opposite each other, they knew each other well, but it was a sort of love-hate relationship all the way through their lives, I think.
And we have a lovely question here from Tim Parker, who also thanks you for the wonderful talk. And he asks, how many unique plant species have come from Nymans?
Wow, that is a very difficult. Certainly you can count a large number which have the Messel name, or indeed are the members of the broader Messel family to them. So the Camellia Maud Messel, Camellia Thomas Messel, Camellia Leonard Messel, sorry, Magnolia Thomas Messel, and various of these other different magnolias and camellias. The flowering shrubs were really the plants which they excelled at Nymans. But there are so many others which you can follow through, and which won prizes from the Royal Horticultural Society at Chelsea Flower Show and at other shows in London all the way through the 20th century. So it has been an incredibly rich centre for horticultural experimentation, and indeed many of the really well-known plants that people have in their own gardens today owe their genesis to work that was done at Nymans back in the day. But exactly how many, I'm afraid I'll have to
Oh, well, maybe Tim can come back to us on that if he finds out. And I, for one, shall certainly be getting back to Nymans as soon as I can. It's a while since I visited, and it's such a marvellous place to go. So that seems a very good place to bring your wonderful talk this evening to an end, John. And I'm sure everyone would like to join me in thanking you very much for such a wonderful, rich presentation. I'd also like to thank our colleagues behind the scene, Clint and Ellen, who've helped to make the smooth running of the technical side tonight, and to you, our virtual audience. And I hope you will join us again next month for our delayed discussion between Philippe Garner and Benary's David Breuer on another celebrated photographer, this time Helmut Newton, which will kick off an exciting summer presentation on American emigre contributors. So please continue to follow us online at our website, and thank you once again to John, and good evening to everybody.